Hey everyone, this is Andy Melbuff, and in this video we're going to take a look at using the random number generator function using computation layer in Desmos Activity Builder. Starting off simply, what you're looking at here is a preview of a graph component, and also we've got here a note component right above an action button. This action button is in blue, and the purpose of this action button is when the student presses it, a new ordered pair appears on the graph. And this can happen a variety of times. And the reason this new point has new coordinates each time is we've tied in what's called a random number generator function into the computation layer. So let's dive into this and take a look behind the scenes at how we make this type of activity work. First of all, I want to show you in this graph component here, there's very little showing other than an ordered pair AB. Now, AB, Desmos needs sliders in order to graph it. Watch what happens. We can move the sliders left and right and create a variety of points there. But if we want the action button through the random generator button to control this, what we're going to do is we're going to take these sliders out. Now, Desmos won't graph these right now because it doesn't know what A and B are. We're going to define the numbers A and B in the computation layer. So in this computation layer, I've already got some script built in. And again, anything with a hashtag or pound symbol next to it is just simply a note to myself or to others. So it looks like there's a lot here, but there's really not. Here's the first piece of this script that we're going to look at. We're going to start out by creating a variable R. Now, a variable is created by typing a single letter, a series of letters, or a word, and then we put an equal sign after it. Now, this variable R is going to use the random generator. Okay, that's a function built into the CL in Activity Builder. And R is going to be assigned a random number based on the button that I've already labeled being pressed. So each time the button is pressed, R generates a new number. Well, we want it to generate two new numbers because we want to graph points A, comma B. So we go down here to this part, and we're going to define the number A or assign the number A based on that variable. Here's the variable we created above, and we want that random number to be an integer, and we give it a range. We're going to have it be an integer between -10 and 10. So every time the button is pressed, A becomes an integer between -10 and 10. And we do a similar thing with defining the number B that we used in our graph component. We're going to again use the random number generator to draw an integer between -10 and 10. So again, let's pop into preview mode. Each time this button is pressed, we get a new X and Y coordinate to show on the graph. In a similar fashion, we can also get random numbers generated that are not just integers, but are any real numbers. So this is almost a duplicate of the previous screen, except this ordered pair that you're looking at here is not just integers, it's real numbers rounded to 3 decimal places. So each time this button is pressed, we get a new ordered pair generated. And let me show you how that works behind the scenes. There's nothing different in the graph component. We're going to graph an ordered pair A, comma B. A and B are not defined right now, but we will define them in the computation layer. And this looks very similar to what we just saw. We're going to create the variable R that uses the random generator based on the button being pressed. Each time the button is pressed, R generates a new number. And we define A and B down here below. But what I want you to notice is instead of having the button be an integer or the button press producing an integer, it produces a floating real number value between -10 and 10. And of course, these values can be changed. I can just simply make that go from -10 to 1. Button or number B is also defined here using a floating number from the random generator between -10 and 10. Let's see what happens now that we've changed our a to go from -10 to 1. If we jump into preview mode, every x-coordinate is between -10 and 1. So we can restrict what the student might see when generating points. On this next slide, there's no graph component, but instead we're going to use the random generator to produce integers to go into an equation. So here's an equation, a quadratic equation in standard form, and its coefficients are 4, 6, and 7. Each time this button is pressed, those coefficients will change based on the random generator that we've set up in the computation layer. So let's jump out of preview mode. And this right here in the note is just basically describing what's going to happen in the background. And all of this happens in the computation layer. Again, I have a button down here. I've just titled or labeled all my buttons button for convenience. Here we're going to have our R set up, our variable, to be a random generator. And each time the button is pressed, it's going to get activated to give a different number. And this time we're going to have 3 different letters or 3 different numbers that we're going to produce. We're going to produce A, and B, and C. Now, A, B, and C are set up to produce random integers between 1 and 10. So each time that button is pressed, A becomes a different number, B a different number, C a different number, and they're all integers between 1 and 10. And also below this, here's our content sink. This is what will actually show up in the note. And I put some text in here. Here's a quadratic equation in standard form. And then we can use those variables, A, B, and C, in the equation right here. Now notice that the equation is enclosed in backticks. The backtick is right there. I'm kind of highlighting it. It's the button to the left of the numeral 1 on a keyboard. And when we enclose things in backticks in a note like this, what that does is put it in mathematical notation, math script, math type, if you will. And then variables, we insert a variable. Here's how we insert the variable A into that equation. We use a $sign and then enclose A in curly brackets. And we do the same with B and with C, as you can see right there. So each time this button is pressed, new coefficients are generated. Now, sometimes you've seen a 1 in here, like in this particular case, and that's typically not written. And there are some ways you can work around that if you're very formal about how you want your equation to look, but I'm just trying to show you how to set up initially with this random generator. On this screen, we've got a graph component back, but rather than a single ordered pair, we've got a line shown here. And we've got that tied into an action button right here that says get a new line. And watch what happens each time we press the button. A new line is generated on the graph, and this can run infinitely many times. So how do we make this happen in the computation layer? First, I want to show you what I put in the graph component. Nothing other than y equals f of x. And Desmos can't graph this right now, doesn't know what f is. We're going to define f in the computation layer. So I'm going to leave that alone right now, even though it's got that warning symbol. And we're going to jump into the computation layer. And some of this might look familiar to you. I'm using R again as my variable for a random generated number that comes from the button being pressed. So that's the same as before. And rather than using A and B now as my variables, I'm choosing to use the variable M to represent slope. And M is going to come from the random generator. It's going to be a floating number, which means it's not an integer, it's a real number. And it's going to be between -1 and 1. And again, we can change these values if you wish. Let me go ahead and change that to a 3. And now we'll get a slope between -1 and 3. And we're also going to set up B, which will represent the y-intercept, as also coming from that random generator, but it's going to be an integer, not just a real number with a decimal place. So then M and B, I'm going to put in to a function. Recall that we had y equals f of x in the graph component. Here's where we're going to define what f is. So I'm going to use the simple function sync, or the function sync, and I'm going to define f as being a simple function. And then in the parentheses, here's what we're going to define. I'm going to put in my variable m times x plus my variable b. So that'll be what the function f will be. So each time this button is pressed, we get a new slope and a new y-intercept, and now my slope is between -1 and 3, my y-intercept between -3 and 3. On this next screen, we're going to get a little fancier. Sometimes we may want to put some conditions in how we generate these random numbers. So at the top it says random number between two intervals. Let's say we want a random number between -10 and 10, but we don't want to have 0 be a possibility. So what we're going to do is make two intervals, and we're going to use another random number to choose from those two intervals. So before we do that, let me just click on this a few times so you can see right here what's being generated. Right now there's a -9 on the screen, -2, -4. Each time I click this button, we get a number between -10 and 10, but notice there are no zeros in there. And also, and I've tied this button into a different note down here, we can also choose from a list of numbers that aren't in any certain sequence. For example, if we had a list of 4 numbers, -8, -2, 14, and 23, we can use a random generator to choose one of those 4 each time this button is pressed. Right now it's a 23, -8, -2, -2, 23, -2, 23. Each time I press this button, this changes to one of these here. So let's take a look at this, how we put this together using Computation Layer. Okay, in the first scenario, in this first note that I have right here, I've got my directions for the student, and you can see I've got a variable that I've called variable right below that, and then there's an action button. We're going to hold off on this note down here for right now. I want to go into the computation layer for this first note. This is all the same, so we'll just skip right over that. But now we're creating an interval. So I'm creating another variable, and I'm calling that variable intervals. And that intervals variable is going to be based on the random number generator. But I'm only giving it two choices. It can be the integer 1 or it can be the integer 2. One or the other. No other choices there. So if I'm having two intervals, I'm going to have two options for what that interval variable can be. It can be the number 1 or it can be the number 2. And then what I'm going to do is make another variable down here that's going to use the variable intervals in it. So when that intervals variable has a value of 1, we're going to make it, the variable here, be an integer between -10 and -1. And if it's not a 1, we're going to make the variable value be between 1 and 10. So what's happening here is we're going to pick from negative values if it's a 1. We're going to pick from positive values if it's not a 1 or if it's a 2. And then this variable word here, I'm going to insert into the note right here using this. And here are the available variables. And I maybe shouldn't have used the word variable. It's making this a little confusing sounding, but that's how that works right there. Now, this button, I can also tie into another note. So down here on this bottom note, here's that list of 4 numbers. Going into the computation layer, here's the same part that we started with before, but rather than intervals, I really just have to choose from one of 4 numbers. So I'm going to make I've called this chooser because, I don't know, just a different word, I guess. And we're going to let the variable chooser be a random integer between 1 and 4. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then I'm going to make my variable display down here. That's what I should have used earlier. So when the chooser is equal to 1, it's going to assign display a value of -8. When chooser is equal to 2, it's going to assign the word display a value of -2. When the chooser is 3, it's going to assign the third value in the set that I want to use, 14. Otherwise, it's going to choose 23. And that's how we can use another variable to set up how we're going to display a number that's in a non-random, or that's in a very randomized set. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a look at how we can use the random generator to create some different situations for students. Thanks.